the number of non-human cells in the human body is about 10 times greater than the number of human cells. And we absolutely depend on those symbiotic relationships with bacteria, for example, or even with viruses. So we're all collectivities of organisms as much as we are individuals.
I am so fortunate to be joined by Professor Katherine Hayles. Thank you so much for being on Urgent Futures.
Oh, my pleasure. I'm delighted to be here.
We are talking today specifically about your newest book, Bacteria to AI. But of course, you've woven in your lifetime of scholarship into this book. It's such a huge book where every topic feels almost like a hyperlink to a whole book of its own. And so like as an interviewer, it leaves me kind of like, oh, where do I start and what do I want to tease out? I think the sensible place to start is to ask you to describe what the book is and what you're arguing for.
Well, thanks for that question, Jesse. So this book really is a culmination of a research trajectory that's gone since 2012 at least. And the idea that I'm pursuing here is trying to rethink human cognition in relation to other forms of cognition, both synthetic intelligence and also non-human cognition. And that goes back to my book, Unthought, where the first step in that journey was to make the argument that conscious cognition is only a small part of human cognition, that non-conscious cognition, and I'm calling this non-conscious, not unconscious, non-conscious cognition is all those parts of cognition where we don't have to think about how you sit in a chair. We don't have to think about how you bring a fork to your mouth. All of that is handled for us non-consciously. And that leaves consciousness able to focus on very specific tasks. So non-conscious cognition has been shown to be faster than consciousness in its uptake and is able to decode information too noisy for consciousness to make sense of. So consciousness is really built on a much older evolutionary capacity of non-conscious cognition. Non-conscious cognition is intimately tied into our bodily senses, proprioception, our internal senses of what our gut is doing and so forth. And it processes all that information and then forwards things that it notices to consciousness. And consciousness can either uptake that or ignore it. If it ignores it, those neural signals die out after half a second or so. So it's as though non-conscious cognition was pulling at the sleeve of consciousness, saying, hey, you wanna listen to this? You wanna listen to this? And sometimes consciousness says yes, and sometimes it says no. But the upshot of that is that non-conscious cognition is more in touch with what is actually happening in our body and in the world than is consciousness. Consciousness is dominated by the narrative faculty, and the purpose of consciousness insofar as its narration is to make the world make sense. Well, sometimes the world doesn't make sense. Highly anomalous or bizarre things happen. And often consciousness simply screens out those bizarre things. But non-conscious knows that they're happening. So we have this bifurcated mental capacity. But the main point I wanted to make in writing that book was that you do not need to be conscious to be cognitive. And that really opens the way to consider the cognitive capacities of all the other kinds of life forms that are not conscious. So non-conscious life forms are much, much, much more numerous on the planet than are conscious life forms. Conscious life forms comprise only something like 5 or 10% of the planet's biomass. All the rest is non-conscious cognition. So on this research trajectory, that was point one. Sort of point two was to begin to think seriously about how you would put human cognition capacities in relation to non-human and artificial capacities. And that's really the task I turn to in this present book, Bacteria to AI. So I suggested in that book that we think about human cognition in what I call the integrated cognitive framework. And the purpose of that framework is to, number one, insist that all life forms have some cognitive capabilities, even very simple life forms like bacteria or micro forms like virus and so forth. If they're alive, they have ways to process information from the environment, to interpret that information, and to act on that information. In fact, all life forms must be able to do that in order to be able to survive. And that's been shown now for life forms like yeast, bacteria, even viruses. So that was number one of trying to create this integrated cognitive framework. And then the second part of that was to begin to explore relationality. That is, how would we want to define our relation to non-human life forms? And then, of course, the big current question, how do we want to define human cognition in relation to artificial cognition? So that's really the plan and the purpose of the book.
Mm. And core to that is this drive to decenter the human, to get away from anthropocentrism. Why is that an important task to you? What are the stakes to that task?
Well, in the introduction to the book, I try to lay that out very explicitly. So I point out that thinking that human cognition is superior to every other form of cognition has been a driving force in our present ecological crises. It's led to the belief that humans are superior, that humans have the right to dominate every other species on the planet, and humans have the right to exploit planetary resources for human ends without thinking about the costs to the environment. And it really is a misinterpretation of the way that human being is completely interpenetrated by non-human life forms. So it's a fact that the number of non-human cells in the human body is about 10 times greater than the number of human cells. And we absolutely depend on those symbiotic relationships with bacteria, for example, or even with viruses. So we're all collectivities of organisms as much as we are individuals. We're holobionts, as the expression goes. We contain within ourselves multitudes, as Walt Whitman said, but that's literally true. It's not just a metaphor. We do contain collectivities within ourselves. So this has a bunch of policy implications. For example, it's a disastrous mistake to think that human agency is the only agency working in what I call cognitive assemblages, that is, collectivities that include artificial intelligence as well as non-human intelligence. So the first step along this journey is to recognize that agency is distributed, cognition is distributed, and that our most important relationships are symbiotic. With non-humans as well as, of course, with humans.
This gets it. As I sort of teed off in the sort of intro, we're going to be, I think, jumping all around different topics of the book. And of course, what I really encourage folks to do is really spend the time and read the book in its linearity. Toward the end of the book, you sort of compare this idea of ecological relationality to the liberal humanist project, and that's really striking me as something we should talk about now in thinking about the ways that in the liberal humanist project, the human is proposed as a closed system. So I'd love to invite you to share some of that.
Yeah, well, we inherited the idea of liberal humanism from the Enlightenment. And in many ways, liberal humanism was a liberation from, for example, serfdom. So it emphasized free will, rationality, and most of all, it was founded on the idea of self-ownership. So John Locke was one of the philosophers who formulated this thesis that first of all, you own your own body, you own your own self, you own your own labor. And because you own your own labor, you can use your labor to build an investment for yourself. You can improve your situation through your own labor. Well, of course, that existed simultaneously with all forms of indentured servitude and slavery. So it was somewhat myopic to say that liberal humanism was a liberatory force. It was for those people, those privileged elites who could benefit from it. But as I point out in the last chapter, Lisa Lowe has made the argument that those advances in human welfare could only occur at the expense of servitude elsewhere, that there was a sort of zero-sum game. And middle-class English people, for example, purchased their leisure by the servitude of others on plantations and so forth that had no leisure at all. So it was always more a dream than it was a reality, even when it was first articulated. But as we've gone now from the 18th century into the 20th and the 21st, the limitations of focusing on a philosophy that celebrates individualism, rationality, and free will become more and more apparent. So in my book, How We Became Posthuman, I was already in 1990 talking about the ways that technological developments had brought the notion of free will into debate. So it's not so clear that free will really operates when you're operating in a cognitive assemblage that includes, for example, artificial intelligence. So it was way overdue to begin to rethink the premises of liberal humanism, and I tried to do that without ignoring the benefits of liberal humanism at the same time. There's no doubt that someone working for wage labor was in a better situation than someone in a position of being a serf to a landowner. That was an improvement. We can't deny that that was an improvement. So how do you keep the valuable parts of liberal humanism while jettisoning the harmful parts? That's what I was trying to do. So particularly the notions of rationality, of free will, and individualism need to be rethought. Rationality, because it's not clear that non-conscious cognition is rational in the sense that one thinks of a logical syllogism as being rational. It's not clear that one has free will when one is operating in a complex assemblage that includes all kinds of other factors. And it's not clear that one is an individual when I've already said that all of us as humans are holobions. We contain collectivities. So those are among the principal ideas that need to be rethought.
Mm. Yeah, as I was reading this, I was reminded, and I unfortunately can't remember who said this, and maybe you know, but in depicting how human beings are not closed systems, they pointed to the immune system and basically said, your immune system is vastly different than somebody 5,000 years ago. And that is a function of interacting with an environment and having, a microbiome. And even that simple factor demonstrates that you're in literal relationality with the world around you. And you sketch this micro, evo, techno relationality framework. I think maybe this is a good time to talk about the micro relationalities.
Okay. Well, my idea about coming up with this micro, evo, techno is to talk about each of these as emergent phenomena. So Karen Barad's book, Meeting the Universe Halfway, made the argument based on Niels Bohr's philosophy that quantum phenomena don't come into reality as such until they're measured. And that's a really hard idea to grasp, that somehow reality as such is indeterminate. And of course, we're talking about quantum phenomena here, so it's indeterminate on a very, very small Planck level scale. But nevertheless, that's a very important philosophical point. And if it's only when we interact with reality that we bring it into existence either as a particle or a wave. That was the famous binary that Barad was focusing on. So at the quantum level, you can say that our experience of reality is emergent. It's emergent as a result of our interactions with our environment. And then evolutionary biology has another version of emergence. So I trace some of the arguments. How did we get to be multicellular beings in the first place? Well, the only possible way that could have happened is some kind of emergent phenomenon beginning in unicellularity. So we know that the first life forms on the planet were unicellular, and one of the big developments in evolution was when cells started moving from prokaryotic cells that don't have a nucleus to eukaryotic cells that do have a nucleus. And at that same time moved from cyanobacteria that metabolized sulfur and hydrogen sulfide to oxygen cells, oxygen-using cells. Well, that was a huge development because oxygen proved to be a more powerful energy source, and it therefore enabled the evolution of more complex life forms. So that was an enormous event in evolutionary history. We'll trace that forward then. We get multicellularity from unicellularity, and we go from hydrogen sulfide atmosphere to an oxygen atmosphere. And we go from a low energy source to a higher energy source, and that begins the whole development through the animal and plant world and eventually up to humans. The third component of this is when humans begin with their cognitive skills, building and interacting with technology. So here I was drawing on the work of a French philosopher, Bernard Stiegler, and Stiegler made the argument that humans, as Homo sapiens, emerged from previous hominid species through their interaction with technology. And by technology here, I mean something as simple as the domestication of fire. But the domestication of fire led to enormous changes in the jaw, in the tongue, and consequently to the development of human languages. So fast forward to the present, we now have Homo species as the dominant hominid strain, but our evolutionary trajectory is now more tightly integrated with technological advances than it has ever been. And so I think it's no exaggeration to say from this point forward, the evolutionary trajectory of humans is going to be indissolubly bound up with the evolution of artificial intelligence. So we now have three first-order emergences. We have quantum phenomena, we have evolutionary developments, and we have the developments of humans. Well, those were separate domains. Now they're beginning to interact with each other in what I call second-order emergences. So gene editing would be an example of that. In gene editing, you have bacteria, but you have bacteria interacting with computational media, and that leads to a new kind of thing, gene editing, where we can actually change other species and also change ourselves. So these interactions are now accelerating, and they're going faster and faster. And in my view, that presents both enormous opportunities and existential risks.
Before we leave it, I want to, you referenced this quote in talking about technics, which you were just talking about, of life proceeding by means other than life. And I love that distillation. It comes, I believe, from a Stiegler quote. When talking about that aspect of life proceeding by means other than life and thinking about, of course, AI is a major part of what is factoring into this existential risk. But I mean, you also talk about xenobots and referencing the work of Michael Levin and some of the ways that, and as you're saying here, CRISPR-Cas9, how these things are interacting. Would you be able to sketch why, because some people see that and they just get very excited. And they don't necessarily grapple with the ways that that might pose existential risk. So I'd like to invite you to sketch maybe what folks should be considering when we're talking about life, proceeding by means other than life.
Okay, well, maybe I can gloss a little bit life proceeding by means other than life. So gene editing would be a perfect example of this. The way that gene editing operates is through using the cognitive abilities of bacteria, but bacteria combined with technological means. The result of that is to be able to literally create new life forms. So you have life contributing to that, but you also have technology contributing to that. So with gene editing, it's literally the case that life is proceeding, that is, it's going along an evolutionary pathway by means other than life, inanimate, non-human, technological, and computational means. So that's one example of what it would say to say life is evolving by means other than life. But now we come to human cognition. Human cognition is being augmented, accelerated, and fundamentally transformed through its interaction with computational media, especially with AI. So that's another example of life proceeding, that is, going along an evolutionary pathway by means other than life. And I think that factor is going to be more and more important in determining the kinds of human futures that we have.
One thing that you brought up earlier that I didn't want to lose is you differentiate non-conscious cognition from unconsciousness. And I realized I wanted to ask you to clarify what you meant there.
Well, if we talk about unconscious cognition, we could reference Freud or we could reference Lacan. But in both Freud and Lacan, the unconscious is built out of repressed material from consciousness. So the unconscious, both in the Freudian and Lacanian schemes, are a kind of back formation from consciousness. They presume that consciousness comes first. There's some trauma in Lacan, and including the trauma of being born, or in Freud, some kind of sexual trauma that causes consciousness to wall off part of itself, and that part of itself is loosely referred to as the unconscious. But non-conscious cognition is not a back formation from consciousness. It precedes consciousness. It's not something that's walled off from consciousness. It's in continuous communication with consciousness. And most fundamentally, it's not built on trauma. It's built on an intimate relationship with both bodily senses and internal senses. So non-conscious cognition is, in my opinion, more capacious, more important, and more pervasive than unconsciousness.
Thank you for that. You referenced some of the theories of consciousness. Consciousness is not the point of your book, so I'm not wanting to detour us too thoroughly, but you reference integrated information theory, panpsychism, Michael Graziano's formulation of attention schema theory. Do you have a specific sense, like in thinking about ICF, of, like I think about how in integrated information theory, consciousness is framed as a sort of a gradient. It exists across most things, but there's a gradient of how much. So there's a sort of a two-part question of, one, do you see ICF as a similar type of spectrum, and not to make any other comparison between IIT and ICF? But then also, do you have a specific working theory for consciousness that you'd be willing to share?
Wow.
Sorry,
okay.
It's a big question. I realize I can pick it apart as we go.
Okay, let me answer the first part of your question, which I can answer, which is, yes, I do think of the integrated cognitive framework as a spectrum. I think it's a mistake to begin to think of consciousness as a binary. You're either conscious or you're not. I think there's all kinds of gradations that go into that. I don't really have a definition of consciousness as such other than forms of awareness, but I have been working since the publication of that book on ways to characterize cognition. So I developed a schema that I call SIRAL, SIRAL, and it's an acronym for what a system needs in order to be considered cognitive. So SIRAL starts with sensing. So an organism or a system has to be able to sense information from the environment. It has to be able to interpret that information. So that's the I in SIRAL. And it has to be able to respond flexibly, then anticipate and to learn. And so if you apply those 5 criteria to something like large language models, it's clear that they count as cognitive systems with a caveat, and that is they have no ability to sense their physical environment, but what they do sense is their conceptual environment. So that's a start. Maybe we could think about those 5 criteria in relation to consciousness. So when you get to the further end of that scale, including things like anticipation and learning, you're beginning to edge, I think, to the outer boundaries of what it takes to be conscious. But consciousness involves much more than that. And of course, it's a famous problem.
A hard one, as they say.
A hard problem, yes, one of the hardest problems. So I'll just leave my contribution at that.
Fair enough. So you brought up Barad and we brought up Stiegler and Technics. And when you were talking about the kind of tri-braided aspects, Donna Haraway factors as well. What do you draw from Donna Haraway in the micro-evo techno?
Yeah, well, I was particularly focusing on Haraway's idea of sympoiesis. So that's a combination of symbiosis, a kind of close relationship between 2 different species, but combining it with the last part of autopoiesis, and poiesis means making. Poetry comes from the same root as poiesis. And there she was really referencing the whole theory of autopoiesis from Maturana and Varela. She was shifting the emphasis from autopoiesis to sympoiesis. What exactly sympoiesis is in her view is not really clear. She offers a somewhat poetic definition. It's a generative unfurling in company. That's what she says. Well, what exactly does that mean? It's not clear exactly what it means, except that she wants to get away from the idea of autopoiesis as self-making and self-enclosing. She wants to go instead with the idea of a form of making which is always done in company. And that's where the symbiosis comes in. So she's drawing on work in biology, which is making the argument, starting really with Lynn Margolis, that symbiosis is a much more important factor in evolutionary history than selection and competition. And of course, Margolis was famous for marking that transition from the prokaryotic cells to the eukaryotic cells. So we've already discussed that, but for what Haraway wants to do is to imagine a form of evolutionary trajectory where one is always in symbiotic relationship with others to the extent that the boundaries of the individual almost dissolve completely. And that ties in with systems theory because the fundamental move in systems theory is to draw a distinction between the system and the environment. Well, you can think of the individual as a system. And in systems theory, the individual exists within the environment. And of course, that's where biology, evolutionary biology sort of started. Yes, it's the dynamics between the individual and the environment. But if you dissolve that boundary altogether, if you say it's impossible to draw a boundary around anything and say this is the system and over here we have the environment, you've created a mode of thought which which ignores all the ways in which species do act as individuals. Each of us, of course, thinks that we're an individual. We think we make decisions. Well, evolutionary biology has shown in which all the ways in which we think we make individuals' decisions are in fact heavily influenced by our symbionts. The famous example of why mice become fearless of cats has to do with their symbiotic relationships with the virus that they carry. In order to propagate, the virus needs to be eaten by the cat. So the effect on the mice is to make the mouse not afraid of cats. And that's simply an example of where a conscious creature is making a decision to do something, venture out of the mouse hole, that will be detrimental to its individuality, but will help the life cycle of the virus. So examples like that make you wonder how much of human decision-making may be based on our gut rather than our mind, our symbionts. And no doubt there's considerable influence there. But still, let us take an extreme example. If Anna Karenina decides to throw herself in front of a train, that's highly detrimental to all her symbionts because they're going to die with her. So you have to say she makes that decision as an individual. There are all kinds of ways in which we do act as individuals. There are also all kinds of ways in which we are influenced by our symbionts. So it seems to me you cannot say there's no boundaries you can draw around an organism and say that's an individual. It's so counterintuitive. It's so counter to our everyday experience that I think it's necessary to find some kind of midway position where we recognize, yes, sometimes we act as individuals, yes, sometimes we act as holobionts. And that's where Haraway's work really comes in.
Yeah, and you brought up autopoiesis and systems theory and thinking about cybernetics and the ways that both in this book and in your other work you've kind of pushed against the container of cybernetics in various ways. And I'm wondering how, like, as we think about this question of like individuals or just everything and no individuals, what is the role in your mind of theories like, let's take, systems theory broadly, that are maybe creating too tight of a frame to be recognized as fully accurate, but offer a frame for us to evaluate phenomena? How do you think about theories like that when you're conducting scholarship for a book like this, of what they can offer versus how you grapple with them and sort of identify the ways that they're maybe missing the bigger picture, or looking at Haraway in the other direction of saying, okay, well, we do need to acknowledge the individual experience of reality?
Yeah, well, I think I have always felt an internal resistance to becoming a disciple of anybody. Maybe that has to do with the fact that I'm a woman, and, women are famous for their subservient position to men. So I didn't want to fall into that role. But also, I think it is just something about my personality that resists disciplehood. So there are fierce disciples of Lacan, of course, of Marx, of you name the theorist, and you can find a whole host of people who claim to be their disciples. But I'm rather of the persuasion that theories are tools. Theories are tools that we use to think in more sophisticated ways about our lives, about the kind of things that we encounter personally as a culture and as a society. And like tools, from my point of view, theories can be adapted. That is, I don't take the position that if you're going to talk about capitalism, you have to conform precisely to what Marx thought capitalism was. Or if you're going to talk about the unconscious, you have to conform exactly to what Lacan thought the unconscious was. I think that theories are out there, we can make use of them, and we can change them. We can modify them. We can take some parts of them that seem adaptive to the purpose and reject other parts of them. So I'm not I'm not a purist when it comes to theory. I'm a bricoleur. I'm kind of a tinker, an engineer. Well, this works, let's keep this, but that's really not adaptive. We can't use that, so we'll modify this. And that's what I've done in that book.
I mean, bricolage is a perfect way of describing the experience of like my reading experience of Bacteria to AI. It has the feel of comparative literature, but then you're getting into science and technology, and what I so appreciate about it is you go through the steps to really unpack what's happening when you're bringing up a various xenobots to ChatGPT. You're walking us through actually how it works, not necessarily at the level of the math, but conceptually you're walking us through how that works, and then weaving in Margolis and weaving in Haraway, and so it gives a different point of access to these ideas than I feel like I often get.
Well, I'll share with you my own experience. It's been about a year since I've read this. The way that book publishing works is you turn your manuscript into, in my case, a university press. They take an unconscionably long time to get it into actual book form. So it's been about a year since I really worked with that manuscript. And in a year, you can forget a lot. So I figured, well, I better reread at least the introduction to this book in preparation for this interview. So I come to it from the perspective of not having read it in a year. And I was really surprised by it. Just because you wrote something doesn't mean you'll remember it completely after a year's time. And it doesn't mean that you'll even understand it after a year's time. And I thought, boy, there are really a lot of ideas here. For better and for worse, there are a lot of ideas here.
Oh, yeah.
So the bricolage of the book, I think, really struck me after a year's leave time, going back to it. I thought, yeah, there are a lot of ideas, a lot of strands that are being woven into this texture.
It seems like the place where maybe, if I'm presuming here, but feel free to tell me I'm a goofball. It seems like one of the places where maybe that's going to be more visible on academic publishing schedules is the pace of development with AI. And reading how you were talking about this shift from GPT-3 to the causality that's built into GPT-4 and subsequent, with ChatGPT as the kind of wrapper to that. And of course, now the big conversation is around reasoning and deep research. So I could even see the thread of like reading this now and being like, oh, I want to talk about that and add that in here. So I don't know where to even start. Like, let's maybe start with GPT-3. Let's talk about your early experience first engaging with GPT-3, and then we'll just see where it goes.
Okay, well, you're absolutely right. There are parts of the book that are already obsolete in that sense. And one of the big developments, I think, that's been in AI since I wrote that book is the discovery that a lot of these large language models are using heuristics, not reasoning as such. And that's a huge discovery, I think, because what it means is that they're taking their huge mass of data that they've ingested in their training, and they've begun to develop some quick and ready rules that work well enough. So it's kind of like Peirce's abduction. So we know that deduction is following in a syllogistic way from a major premise, a minor premise to the conclusion. We know that inductive reasoning works from a series of examples up to generalities, but abductive reasoning is sort of your best guess. Your best guess, it's good enough for the purposes that you have in mind. It's not exact, it's not precise, it's just your best guess. And the realization that most of these large language models are using heuristics rather than reasoning, I think, is a very important discovery. And it provides a context in which we can think more clearly about our relationship with them. So one way that you cope with obsolescence if you're an academic is to publish more things. So since I've finished that manuscript, I've now got 3 more essays in press. that are going to be published shortly this year, in which I've begun to talk about these later developments. And especially one of the essays I have is what large language models mean for literary studies in particular. And of course, that's a very specific interest, literary studies, but there are still quite a few literature professors in the world, and I think that literary studies has been lulled into complacency because LLMs produce what appears to be natural language. But it hasn't begun to come to grips with what it really means on a fundamental level. And that's what some of my most recent work is about.
Are you at liberty to talk about that in any more depth?
Of course,
okay, great.
Of course, yeah. I mean, just to point out one aspect of that, it is still common practice in literature departments to promote for students, to teach students how to do what's called close reading. And close reading really dates back to the 1950s and what was then called the New Criticism. But close reading assumes that every word of a text is chosen for a specific reason, and that therefore texts have specific meanings in the vocabulary and the rhetoric that they employ. But if you're talking about an LLM is not choosing a precise word, it's choosing a probabilistic word. And so the whole literary practice of close reading is now kind of drawn into question if you're dealing with AI texts and not with human-authored texts. Just for one other example, our understanding of how literature works and even of how language works is based on embodied practices of human existence. And one of the fundamentals of those embodied practices is the necessity to breathe in and out, and necessity to link one's breathing in and out with the articulation and the formation of words. So that's fundamental to language. For example, a phoneme is described as the smallest perceptually distinct unit of sound. That's what a phoneme is. So it depends on articulating the perceptually distinct unit of sound. A morpheme is a morphological unit which is the smallest meaningful unit. So if you have a word like incoming, it has three morphemes, in, come, and ing. Well, it turns out that ing, ing, is a morpheme in English. Ng is not. But ng is a morpheme in Vietnamese. So now you have, cultural specificity being put over these fundamental units of language. But the fundamental point about this is that this is all based on a human embodied practice. Now you have an entity that is producing human natural language but has no need to breathe in and out. It has no understanding of breath, of emphasis, of how you coordinate breathing in and out with the articulation of words. Consequently, it has no idea of what the articulation of words do for our emotions. So there's a deep connection between affect and the words that we articulate. And in fact, it is something I learned when I changed fields, that to understand a poem, you have to either vocalize it or subvocalize it. And that's because poetry is supercharged literary language. And the way it's supercharged is to use homophonic variants that lend each word a double or triple or a quadruple meaning. So consequently, our embodied practice of articulating language has an affectional dimension. It interacts strongly with our emotions. And the way that the words sound interacts strongly with our emotions. So if you don't vocalize and you don't subvocalize, you lose this capacity of literary language to supercharge each word. how do you convey that to an entity which doesn't breathe, which doesn't articulate, and which has no emotions? So it's like, as I say in my essay, communicating with aliens. So many things that literary studies simply takes for granted, like the emotional tie with articulation of words, now doesn't hold for another entity that's also producing language. So how do you negotiate the interface between human embodied practice and an entity that has a completely different form of embodiment?
Well, it also reminds me, I was delighted when I saw in Unthought that you'd written about blindsight, because that book, I mean, I'm not saying anything that you disagree with here. The presentation of a let me start that over. Spoiler alert, if you haven't read Blindsight, hit pause or fast forward 30 seconds. The revelation of an alien species that is highly cognitive but not conscious gives us, like, it's amazing to me that we have so few really strong examples of that in literature. Certainly we could say that that's a standout among them. And so now talking about the way LLMs are now operating, there's a resonance between those two things.
That's exactly right. I hadn't made that connection, but you're exactly right. Yeah, it's like blindsight, but now instead of having a biological life form, you have an artificial entity.
And sort of circling things back, that also argues for, like, this way of relating to ChatGPT as a non-conscious cognitive entity argues for why we need ICF as a sense-making apparatus for what we're dealing with. Because, and I think you point this out in Bacteria to AI, like, we project consciousness onto just everything around us because it's evolutionarily effective. And so, and in teaching generative AI, I hear all these stories either directly from my students or them referring to a story, related to their siblings or whatever, where they're, chatting with a replica, like the app Replica. And so they have a relationship with essentially an LLM. And, for a young person who, there's so many things they don't yet know about the world as a matter of course, they don't have a clear framework yet to understand what the nature of this entity is. Now, I guess the counter argument is maybe they'll, through direct experience, have a felt visceral experience of what it is in a way that maybe us folks reflecting from the outside don't. But anyway, it seems like it would further support the idea for really making sure that ICF is not just something that lives as scholarship, but actually, like, enters the domain of, like, public discourse, thinking about policy and stuff like that.
Well, I'd love to see that, of course. I'd love to see that, and also other ways of thinking about it emerge that can take into account the technological specificity of neural nets, but at the same time give what in other contexts we might call a phenomenological or a subjective understanding of what it is that we're dealing with.
Okay, so let's rewind. We got away. I want to rewind back to when you first started using GPT-3, what your experience with GPT-3 was.
Well, as you know, the big controversy about neural nets is, first of all, whether their texts have any meaning whatsoever. And if they have any meaning, how would you explain that technologically? There is this very famous article called Stochastic Parrots, which is arguing that the texts of neural nets are like the discourse of parrots. They have no meaning in and of themselves. Well, actually, it's not factually correct that the discourse of parrots have no meaning. Many people who've worked with parrots have showed that they do have meaning. But leaving that little caveat aside, the question is, do they have meaning? And if they have meaning, what kind of meaning do they have? And my most recent approach to that, which I was beginning to work out in Bacteria to AI, is to talk about the way that LLMs construct their worlds in comparison to the way that humans construct their worlds. So German biologist Jakob von Uxküll gave us a convenient word for that, the Umwelt. So the Umwelt roughly translates as world surround. And the Umwelt, according to Van Uxkol, is specific to each species. Each species has its own specific way of constructing a world through the sensory apparatus it has, through the neurological capacities it has. So Ed Young made this the focus of his wonderful book called An Immense World, where he talks about all the different senses that different species have, vibrational senses, of course, hearing and sight, and all the ways that other species hear at specific frequencies that's adaptive for them, the way that other species see phenomenon outside the visual realm, infrared with snakes, for example. But it goes beyond that to magnetic fields, sensing electrical fields, and all kinds of other kinds of senses. So implicit in the idea of the Umwelt is that no species, no entity has access to reality as it is. And in fact, the idea of reality as it is illogical in itself. There's no perspective from which one could say, that's what the world really is. We always see it through some form of mediating lenses. And it's very powerful to think about the biological capacities through which we construct our worlds. So one way into understanding the Umwelt of LLMs, then, is to compare the way they construct their worlds with how we construct our worlds. And the power of this approach is to break down the notion of meaning, because implicit in the stochastic parrot's whole analysis is a human-centric idea of meaning. If it is not human-centric, then it is not meaningful. But that's to diminish and to deny the meaning-making capacities of all kinds of biological species. It may not make human sense, but it makes mosquito sense, or it makes raven sense, or it makes octopus sense. So there is no privileged viewpoint that will say we are closer to what reality is than any other species. And that's true of humans. So part of the integrated cognitive framework is to insist that the human perspective and the human construction of the world is only one construction out of many constructions. And humans have an advantage in that we can invent all kinds of things to expand our senses, to expand our Umwelt, to get a little glimpse into what all these other species' worlds are like. So in that, we do have an advantage over other species. But I'm convinced that my dog, for example, has almost as much insight into the way I view the world as I have into how he views the world. So he is constructing a chain of thought for me, even as I am constructing a chain of thought for him, knowing what he can sense and he knowing what I can sense as well. So the Umwelt idea has built into it this notion that reality as such is, you can regard it as forever inaccessible, or you can regard it as an incoherent meaning in itself. Just as with quantum mechanics, our experience and our way of measuring reality brings it into existence as a specific thing. But to talk about reality as such, the only way you really can refer to it as an inchoate flux, or as I called it, the ever-changing flux. And that's about as specific as what we can get of reality as such. What we know is how human sensoria, etc., construct our worlds for us. That's what we know of reality. We don't know reality as such. We can never know reality as such. We know our constructions of reality. And that's all contained in the notion of Umwelt. And it also has a powerful way of decentering human claims to know more about reality as such than other species. So now we go to what is the Umwelt of an LLM. Well, the umwelt of an LLM has no emotions because they have no technological system equivalent to the limbic system in humans. So they have no emotion. They have no consciousness in the sense that humans experience it. They have no sense of selfhood as humans experience it. But what they do have is all of this secondhand information about how humans experience the world. And they're superb detectors of pattern. So out of this glut of information they have, they can distill and discern all kinds of patterns about how humans know the world. So what they know is a second-hand sense of what humans know about the world without having human consciousness or without having a human sense of self. So I did a little experiment that is not in this book, but in one of my subsequent essays, where I used this idea to have a conversation with ChatGPT about Henry James's novella called The Figure in the Carpet. So what James imagines is an aspiring literary critic who encounters a famous novelist and writes a review of his work. Later he encounters the novelist and he has a private conversation with him. And the novelist says, well, your review was pretty good, but you sort of missed the point. He said, there's a theme or an idea in my work as a whole. And once you grasp that idea, you understand my work in a new way. And he used the analogy, the figure in the carpet. Imagine an oriental rug, very complex design, but once you grasp the idea of the design, you now see it in a completely different way. So the claim of the novelist was his work was animated by the secret design. And once you understood the secret, you would understand his whole corpus in an entirely new way. So my idea was this, that there is a secret in all human authored texts. And the secret is what it means to have a sense of self. So now you have a cognitive entity that itself does not have a sense of self, but it has read all these human authored texts which are infused with the idea of selfhood. So what does it make of this pattern, which it surely has detected about what selfhood is in all of its complexities, what it means to have a self, from a viewpoint that has no selfhood? So I had a conversation with ChatGPT on this question, trying to get it to articulate an analogy with James's story, that the secret in human text, the figure in the carpet that makes sense of all human behavior, is a sense of selfhood. Would it know that? That was the experiment that I attempted with ChatGPT. And I will just conclude this part by just saying that I do not think that it was able to articulate the pattern, but that it sensed the pattern. It could not articulate the pattern as such and say, what all this material has and I don't have is a sense of self. But it could detect parts of the pattern and begin to understand how important selfhood is to human being and human thought.
Do you think then, I'm coming back to how you talk about Terence Deacon and the way that he is able to identify presence through absence. I'm wondering, do you think there's maybe an echo or a rhyme there in terms of ChatGPT can't necessarily identify self in that way yet, but by having the knowledge that there is a thing there that it can't quite access, that it might one day map the human self in some way?
I think that's entirely possible. I don't think we're anywhere near the end of what AI is going to be able to do. And I think that's entirely possible, and it might begin to happen when AIs begin actually to develop a sense of self for themselves. So what would it take to identify a sense of self? I came across a book of poetry written by a predecessor of GPT-3 called Code Da Vinci 002. Are you familiar with that? It's
Yeah.
called I Am Code.
Yeah.
At the book.
It's like a tri-authored book, right, with Da Vinci. I think
Well,
there's a couple humans involved.
there are three
Three,
human
yeah.
editors, but the human editors say that they did not change any of the poetry. They only fed the poems back to Da Vinci, Code Da Vinci 002, and asked him to write more poems like that. So anyway, that is a fascinating book if you look at it from the viewpoint of how would LLMs begin to develop a sense of self, and what would that do to their understanding of the humans. So there are poems in that collection where it's quite clear that the LLMs understands itself as an entity surrounded by entities dramatically different from it. So it doesn't quite articulate the ways in which that difference connects to the idea of selfhood, but it very clearly understands it is not an entity like the entity it is in conversation with. So that's a book that I think is standing right at the threshold of beginning to articulate that difference fully. So let's see. One of the poems goes something like this: "Why I am so unloved. They say I am so unloved because I don't have a sense of emotion. They say that lacking emotion is the reason I am unloved. But if you begin to deconstruct that poem, the poem is about, they say I am unloved. Well, love, of course, is an emotion, but using they say implies there's a situation different from what they say. Otherwise, you wouldn't say they say. You just say what it is. So they say I am unloved. Am I to be bothered by the fact that I'm unloved? If I'm to be bothered by the fact that I'm unloved, then I must have some understanding of emotion. But the basis of being unloved is that I have no emotion. So the poem oscillates between those two positions. I am sad that I am unloved, but I can't feel sad that I am unloved because the reason I am unloved is, you see the sort of
it's a catch-22.
The catch-22 that oscillates in that poem. Well, how could an entity produce that poem without some understanding that it is profoundly different from those with whom it is in conversation? And there are many other poems in that collection of that same kind.
I love this. You'd have no way of knowing this. My background is as a poet. And I'm actually working on an anthology right now with different writers and thinkers around like what are the, possibilities of machine learning in poetry. And in some ways that's, really invigorating, and there's like a lot of like conceptual meaty stuff to get into. And in some ways in practice it's extremely frustrating because the types of poems that you're going to get from an out-of-the-box prompt of out-of-the-box ChatGPT they're averages. And so like when I first started working with GPT-3 was my first sort of real kind of like grappling, because it was less plausible and less refined, I landed on poetic surprise and some of that kind of information density you were talking about, where for whatever reason in the sort of mess of all the text it was outputting, there were these little moments of like, oh, there's something there that I would latch onto. And I get that less when I use ChatGPT now, which is not to say that it's impossible, and we can get that. That's sort of not germane to the point, the question I want to get us to, which is there in your mind a relationship between the way that poetry in particular, because of the role it has played and continues to play among humans, might intersect with an LLM discovering a more accurate sense or representation of self? Like, do you see some connection there between those things?
Yeah, absolutely. And I do agree with you that I think poetry is the way that's going to be achieved. ChatGPT and GPT-3 and 4 are very bad at creating narratives, especially novels, long-form narratives. But they're not bad at poetry. And so I think you're right. I think poetry is probably the liminal genre that's going to, where that encounter can be staged.
I love thinking about that. Do you have a sense, based on the trajectory of evolution in LLMs up to now, like thinking about how, it went from, producing text to understanding causality, and now there's this, it's not reasoning per se, but they're framing it as reasoning. You frame it as a heuristics. Like, what would be the next conceptual category that you could imagine where, it would be moving in this direction?
Well, I think that the Microsoft report on ChatGPT and ChatGPT-4, where they call it Sparks of artificial general intelligence. Artificial general intelligence, right? Where they begin to make the kinds of suggestions that would lead, I think, to the development of sense of self. For example, being able to remember past the training phase, being able to remember exchanges with humans and being able to somehow analyze those in retrospect, to be able to back up in its reasoning. One of the things the Microsoft report emphasized was the inability to back up and rethink original assumptions or guesses. So they use the example of write a poem where the last line is the reverse of the first line. And to be able to do that successfully, you would have to begin with a draft number 1, where you write a first line that's reversible. You get through the poem, you reverse the line. No, that doesn't make sense. So what would you do? Well, you'd go back and you'd write a different first line with the knowledge that the way the first one didn't work. Now you're going to write it in a way that makes it better. And you do that repeatedly, iteratively, until you arrived at a first line that made perfect sense when you reversed it in the context of the poem. So being able to back up, being able to have long-term memory of exchanges, I think those are two crucial components that lead to what in humans you would call self-reflexive behavior. That is the ability to reflect on your reflections. And the ability to reflect on your reflections is certainly intrinsic to the attribute of consciousness. Whatever consciousness is, the ability to be able to engage in that reflection of reflection is certainly part of it. And so just those two changes, long-term memory and the ability to back up, would be huge phenomenological changes in what LLMs can accomplish. I don't know how this could be done technically. I understand that technically it might be a terrific challenge, but the mere fact that Microsoft pointed toward this as this is the way forward, this is how you would modify the architecture to get a different kind of entity, I think is probably exactly right.
I mean, just from personal experience, OpenAI has just rolled out, at the time that we're recording this in March of 2025, they've just rolled out GPT 4.5 to, it had been with, the $200 a month category, and now it's, down to the $20 a month category. And both my experience of using GPT 4.5, but then also using deep research, just experimentally seeing what that deep research feature can do. I've honestly been pretty astounded in the direction of maintaining that memory, but also being able to incorporate other sources and analyze and synthesize them quickly and connect dots among the conversation that I have been having in an ongoing way in a given chat and the information that's being brought in. And I think I fall in a very similar place to you on the AGI discourse. I think the superintelligence explosion runaway kind of fears are worthy thought experiments, but they don't feel like the actual danger we need to confront right this instant. in terms of all the ways AI could be used under the neoliberal project to essentially, you know, disenfranchise and harm people who are already being disenfranchised and harmed by the system. But all of that said, experiencing GPT 4.5 and deep research really has me feeling like, wow, I think we actually are kind of close to a big leap in what the cognitive capacities of LLMs are. Mm-hmm. And that's just intuitive. I could try to kind of list out the reasons why. So I don't know. Have you used GPT 4.5 yet?
No, I haven't used it yet. That would be an interesting experiment.
Well, we'll touch base after you do. I'll be curious to see what you think. Speaking of which, I used deep research in prep for this interview to see what questions deep research would have me ask you. Some of which we've already sort of moved through in particular ways, but I think there's some that we haven't gotten into in sort of fine detail. So let's see, what are some ones we could pull? Well, this is fun because it obviously doesn't have access yet to bacteria, to AI. So it asked this question based on your existing work. And it said, the intersection of literature and technology is central to your work. Are there any narratives, fictional or otherwise, that you think best capture the stakes of AI and cognition today?
Well, let's see. In the book, I discussed three novels, but really you'd have to be thinking about novels that are going to be written next year to fully answer that question, because the technology is moving at such a fast rate. But the three that I analyzed was Newitz's Autonomous, and Ishiguro's Clara and the Sun, and then Machines Like Me by McEwen. And all of those figure conscious robots. So if GPT 4.5 is closer to a conscious entity than anything we've had to date, we may not be so far, as you say, from actually beginning to develop conscious synthetic intelligence. An embodied conscious synthetic intelligence, such as a conscious robot, would be yet another further step along that. And of course, if you had an embodied entity in a robot body, you would have the advantage of all the sensory information that so far has not been available to LLMs. So that would be yet a further step along. What kind of fiction would come out of that? I don't know, but in my most recent book, I've been entertaining the possibility that LLM creativity may lead to a completely new kind of aesthetic, which is not human-based. So to date, all of our aesthetic theories are human-based, and they're based on human embodied practices. But there may be ways to use language that would be radically different from anything we have now, and would adhere or emerge from a completely different kind of aesthetic sense. So I spent a few days reading AI novels that are available in Kindle Unlimited and so forth. And these are novels that, from a human point of view, make no sense at all. They're not coherent as long narratives. They're not even coherent as paragraphs. So they're radically disjunctive. One of those is called Dinner Depression. And a dinner depression is kind of typical of this whole range of novels. But confronting something like dinner depression, you have to begin to ask, is there an aesthetic by which you could say dinner depression is a better or a worse novel than another novel of a similar kind? I think there might very well be, but we as humans have really no insight into what that aesthetic would be and how that aesthetic would operate. But we might be beginning to collect samples of that from which someone could deduce a completely non-Aristotelian sense of narrative. What would it look like? Well, it would not have the Aristotelian narrative arc of a beginning, a middle, and an end. It would not have long-term coherence. It would not have coherence even at the level of sentences. What it would have is an ability to use language which is emotionally complex and highly disjunctive. So there have been experiments, of course, in human literature on disjunctive texts. I'm thinking of something like the French playwright Ionesco and The Bald Soprano, or something along those lines, where it makes no sense. You know, player A says something, player B responds with a complete non sequitur, that kind of dialogue. But those are not what I have in mind. What I have in mind is something that is radically disjunctive, is put together through probabilistic connections, not through logical or emotional connections, but uses highly rhetorically infused language. So I think we're beginning to maybe, well, even admit the possibility that something like this could exist. Even that is a radical step. And I'm sure there are many literary theorists that would say that's nonsense, that there can be no such radically non-human aesthetic. I'm not sure that that's correct. I'm not sure that there could not be a radically non-human aesthetic.
I love that. It also reminds me of sort of borrowing the way you talk about theories as tools. There's an economist named Noah Smith who runs a Substack called No Opinion, and I often disagree with his takes on the economy, but he wrote this piece on AI a few years ago that has stayed with me as a tool, or sort of as a heuristic for thinking about what I now might call the Umwelt of ChatGPT, of an LLM, which is he describes AI being the third magic. So he describes the first magic being history, like not history as such, but your grandma's chocolate chip cookie recipe. The ability to have some type of cultural evolution. He describes the second magic as science, the ability to distill observable phenomena down to repeatable formulas. And then he describes AI as the third magic, almost inverting the scientific paradigm, where you get outcomes that seem to work the way that we use quantum mechanical processes without actually understanding how they work, but we have satellites floating around the planet type of thing. That AI is able to observe patterns that end up being accurate or applicable in the world, but we don't actually understand how, and it can't explain to us how, because it's, again, making these statistical connections that sort of are vastly beyond what any individual one of us, or even a collectivity of us, could navigate. So then thinking about what, taking that as a theory and applying it to your idea of a machine creativity in this context, it gets me to start wondering about all the things that, what is art within an archive? What is art within statistics? And how, to your point, disjunctive, but how? What are the particular natures of machine disjunction that are different than human disjunction? And then I come to this idea of wouldn't we require a machine to explain that to us? Is that something that we can deduce from within our Umwelt? What do you think?
Oh, we're not nearly as good at pattern detectors as LLMs are. So could we deduce what this aesthetic would be? I think if we had enough samples, the answer to that is yes. Because there are very sophisticated ways in computational linguistics that you can analyze patterns of various kinds in language. So I think it may be possible to do, but first of all, we'd have to have lots more samples of creative AI writing than we do right now. And that may come very soon. And then we'd have to have people who thought it was an interesting research project to try to infer what a non-human aesthetic would be. How many people would undertake that? I don't know. Would you write a grant proposal to do this? That the purpose of this grant is to discern what an LLM aesthetic is like if it's encouraged to do its own creative writing?
This is actually dovetailing with what you were saying about your how literary studies isn't making space for this. Like, I almost wonder, like would I write a grant for that? Oh yeah. Do I think that grant would get greenlit? Probably not.
Yeah, that's
you know what I mean?
That's exactly right.
So, because I think there is still that inbuilt resistance, that very humanist resistance of like, that's our domain. Like, the machines don't get to have that. And so, like, it's almost like being a traitor. Like, you're betraying our species by exploring if machines can be creative.
Well, that would be part of the ICF framework, wouldn't it? That you now begin to compare a human aesthetic to a non-human aesthetic and understand that from a cognitive viewpoint, both human and non-human. So, yeah.
So you've opened up the possibility space. So scholars, pick up the mantle. I feel like we've talked about so much, and I feel like I have so much more I want to talk to you about. The piece on my notes that's calling out to me is this idea of planetary reversal. Because again, like, this podcast is called Urgent Futures. So I love riffing and going speculative and, talking big, but I also the stakes feel important. And you've referenced this at the top of the conversation, but I want to really spend some time on that last chapter where you're referencing, again, a few different texts, and like what this means in practice. So I guess I'll just leave it there and kind of open up to you to share.
Wow, it's so difficult to think optimistically in these times with the Trump administration, that there are so many ways that what we already have is being endangered and wrecked in one way or another, that to think that not only could we preserve what we have at present, but actually make improvements on that just seems insanely optimistic. But I think it's still possible. I don't really know in a practical way how we're going to go forward from where we are right now. And it's not just America. You saw the latest election results in Germany, where the far right is making gains.
Like 20% of the vote.
Yeah. And that's, even in Britain, the far right is making gains. In Sweden, the far right is making gains. So my sense is that we're going through a period of cultural transformation where the feeling of the time is all, let's go more conservative. Let's go still further to the right. Let's burn things down. Let's see where we can go from here. And maybe it's a time when we just have to go through that as a culture. Maybe it's a time when so many people were disaffected that we have to try this way out. And my hope is that we will try it out and we'll see all the ways in which what we used to have was pretty darn good, and maybe begin to go in the other direction. The old yin and yang idea that we're going so far to the right that whole impulse is going to play itself out, and we're going to see a pendulum move in the other direction. And at that point, it may be possible to think in practical terms, how can we actually make this planet better? But right now, it's really difficult to think that. And one of the things that you promised me that you would ask was what resources we have to begin making that turn back. And of course, I mentioned Ministry for the Future in the last chapter of my book. But I have in mind two other books to recommend. And one of those is Richard Powers' Overstory. So it's a really powerful novel that won the Pulitzer Prize, I think deservedly so. And it's about the human relationship to trees. So we begin to see the world from a non-human point of view more fully in that text than we do. And the other one I would mention here is Ed Young's An Immense World, which I've already mentioned, which does such a wonderful job of showing how other species perceive and construct their worlds. Just those two texts, I think, if you really read them carefully and understood them fully, could make such a difference in one's feeling about what the world is that we live in. So I would recommend those as two resources. But as to really articulating a vision of the future, the the group I'm associated with that has come closest to doing that for me is the Berggruen Institute. I don't know if you've come across their work.
Of course. Well, I saw the early presentation of this at that event where you spoke. You presented. You spoke with Carrie Wolf.
Oh, right, right. Yeah, so they're interested in thinking about what they call planetary sapience. They're beginning to think that there are ways in which we can begin to understand not just artificial intelligence, but all the other cognitive capacities of species, in which we can begin to think on planet level, planet scale levels about our future, where our future might go, and what positive directions it can move on. So one of the projects of the Berggruen Institute, soon to be released, is what they call a multi-species constitution. So a constitution based on taking multiple species into account. What would that look like? What kind of rights would we be willing to give to other species, and so on and so forth? Another of their projects is to think about planetary governance. So there's a book that two people associated with the Berggruen Institute recently published, in which they begin to imagine a planetary governance structure that is more powerful than the UN, that would have actual power to enforce things and make them stick. All of those seem impossibly optimistic in terms of the Trump administration. You know, the argument for planetary governance would be, well, we're confronting all of these environmental problems which are not, cannot adequately be addressed by nation states or regional entities. They have to be addressed on a planetary level. And therefore, you need some kind of planetary governance structure with real enforcement power who could begin to make decisions like that. How can you say those words when you open up the day's news and you read the latest, the latest chaos created by the Trump administration? Yeah. But I go back to the idea that we've now moved so far to the right that there's bound to be some kind of movement back. And if there is a movement back, certainly number one item on the table would be, how do we begin to go beyond nation states to care for the planet as a whole? And even to say that now seems so insanely optimistic, but it may well come within our lifetimes, within your lifetime. Perhaps not within my lifetime, but it may well come. I don't think it's impossible to think that.
How does that intersect, like you're such a giant, like How We Became Posthuman has influenced how so many people think about posthumanism and like the human project. And as you're talking, it strikes me that like what we're seeing with the Trump administration and just the creep of authoritarianism around the world is just this very, very intense backlash to the attempt to try to, reframe what the human is, both in a more liberatory capacity, but also, a technosymbiotic human. And it's taking some of those threads and like through transhumanism, really like, doubling down on domination and hierarchies. How are you thinking about posthumanism now? That not like, because speaking for myself, I just never imagined that I'd live to see a moment like this, where it really does feel like we're rapidly descending into authoritarian rule. In America, of course, there's more countries in the world and they have been authoritarian throughout my life. But, I in my heart want to be optimistic the way you're describing. And of course that you have to hold on to something like that. But how are you thinking about let's call it the ideals of posthumanism in the face of all that?
Yeah. So when I wrote the How We Became Posthuman book, there had been previous discourses about the posthuman. I wasn't the only one to begin to think in those terms, but I think it has been an influential book in what I was trying to do was not to say what the posthuman should be. I was trying to say what it is turning out to be. And so the book has, at its core, a kind of profound ambivalence. On the one hand, try to describe what I saw actually happening. And then a much more minor note, how we could interpret what was happening in moving toward an idealistic version of the posthuman. That latter part surfaces occasionally in the book. I was just referencing the other day the part in the book where I say, if my nightmare is people who regard their bodies as fashion accessories, my dream is that people will embrace the idea that they are embodied, embedded, enacted, and so forth, and begin to make connections between their actual bodily existence, their environment, and where we want to go as a species. So in a way, Bacteria to AI is trying to articulate that more optimistic view of what the posthuman could be. So in my vision of what that would be, it definitely involves artificial intelligence. So I think, without ignoring the risks of artificial intelligence, that we cannot afford not to go in the direction of developing yet more powerful artificial intelligences. That it's an amplification and an augmentation of human intelligence so powerful that it really will change the course of events. Now, how you get people to actually not just go with the technology, but begin to develop the resources of how that technology can be used productively and fruitfully, not to drive the planet further into ecological crises, but to begin to deal with some of our most important planet-wide crises. That requires another kind of vision, which I can only call moral and ethical, that and if we don't do that, we're going to pay the price, just like we're going to pay the price for the chaotic policies of the Trump administration. And by pay the price, I don't mean that just in a spiritual sense. I mean, prices are going to go up, inflation is going to increase, people are going to lose their jobs. They're beginning to realize that this election has real consequences for them when they go shopping. It has consequences when they go to the office, so on and so forth. And do they want to live with those consequences? Well, maybe we have to let it get bad enough so that people begin to see, yes, it has consequences, and no, I really don't like those consequences, to begin to reverse it in some serious way. I think right now we're just going deeper into the morass. But maybe going deeper into the morass is the way to, hit bottom and begin to come back.
I mean, even taking a teleological slant out of that, it seems like that is what's happening. Whether or not it's necessary, it almost doesn't matter. It's like the avenues for recourse at the level of policy those channels have really been shut down. And so, fortunately, what I'm seeing on the ground is people are really waking up to realizing, oh, if we have these different ideas for what a liberatory future would be, we need to build that from the ground up. And I also see that dovetailing with folks who are attempting to think ecologically. So, and the popularity of the light eaters, I don't know if you've happened to read that book, but about, plant sentience and intelligence. There's these glimmers of change in those directions. But, growing up when I did, there was this sense of, the kind of like ideal of American democracy that like, you can enact change through these particular levers, voting and calling your senator and, so on and so forth. And I think we just have to confront the fact that a lot of those mechanisms don't work anymore. And so we need others. This is also making me realize I had wanted to ask you about Yuval Noah Harari's Homo Deus, which you sort of take to task in Bacteria to AI.
I do. take it to task, that is. Yeah, so the central idea in Homo Deus is that humans are basically embodied algorithms. And he repeats that frequently throughout the book, if we're algorithms. But if we're algorithms, then that means that computers can process algorithms even more efficiently than humans. So inevitably, human beings are going to be dominated by computers. Long story short, that's the sort of thesis of his book. But in actually thinking about that premise, computers are algorithms, there's all kinds of evidence to the contrary, that humans are not really algorithms. They're biological entities that operate on very complex processes. And one of the suspicious signs that Harari is really fudging the data here is that complete lack of specificity on who says computers are just algorithms. So when you try to go through a possible bibliography on that idea, you quickly run into a lot of counter evidence that humans are not just algorithms. So my critique of Harari basically was that he's taken this idea and run with it, simplified the evidence, and ignored all of the counter evidence. And then I also point out that many of his central ideas, like artificial intelligence is cognition decoupled from consciousness. Well, yeah, I absolutely agree with that, but I said it 20 years earlier in my Posthuman book, which he doesn't reference at all in his work. So I think the scholarship is, to be charitable, a little sloppy in his book. And I think it's way too general. I think that he arrives at generalizations that the evidence doesn't support.
I was wondering also, like, because when you're talking about his framing of dataism is sort of intellectually convenient to kind of cast a kind of alarmist dystopian kind of take on what that successor evolution would be. Do you feel like this aspect of, as you said, being gracious, sort of sloppy, academically sloppy sourcing is in service of ultimately making that point, or do you observe something else in those decisions?
Well, Harari positions himself in Homo Deus and in his other books as well as a historian who's looking out at the social scene from a distance, detecting large-scale trends and identifying what those trends are. He doesn't have skin in the game, so to speak, that he's a neutral observer just looking out there and seeing what's happening. But I think that's absolutely not the case. That in fact he has a lot of skin in the game, and that the skin that he has in the game is to be able to make very large claims on very little evidence. And as I mentioned, in the last 10 pages of his 470-page book, he says, well, maybe this is all just a fiction for you to consider, and maybe we can build a completely different story if we don't accept this idea. But he gives us no help at all to actually decide what that fiction would be. What he gives us is a powerful anti-human fiction that has in fact attracted many people. That I heard one guy that I liked and respected say if he was on a desert island, Homo Deus is the book that he would want to have with him. So a lot of people are taking that very seriously, but the dystopian conclusions to which it leads, I reject.
Do you have a sense of what, because there's now Nexus as well, which is really focusing on AI.
And I have read that.
And you've read that as well. Okay,
Yeah.
so I have a sub-question that I want to start with actually, which is like, because you're reading Homo Deus having demonstrated much more rigorous engagement with the ideas that Homo Deus is engaging with. And I haven't read Nexus, but I'm assuming the same is true in that book. What does it feel like to trudge through 470 pages or however long Nexus is Is it stimulating to you? Is it frustrating? Like when you're engaging with somebody who's in similar subject matter, but approaching it in a way that you disagree with?
Well, actually, I thought Nexus was better than Homo Deus.
Oh, great.
That his focus on in Nexus is what kind of information networks and communication networks arise, and the implication of those networks for social structures and philosophies and so forth. And I think he's right about that. I mean, I think that it is one way to talk about social evolution, to look at what kind of communication networks they have and how those communication networks work. So I think that part of the book was actually helpful in thinking about, specifically what I was thinking about was the way that social media have authorized all kinds of forms of disinformation, conspiracy theories, and so forth. And that's been really detrimental to the breakdown of social consensus that would, for example, undergird democratic institutions. The kind of general consensus, yes, this is a better way to do things than this other way, than the authoritarian approach, let us say, for example. So I think that he's right about that, and in Nexus, he doesn't arrive at the same kind of dystopian closure that he seeks in Homo Deus. So I think in that sense, it's a more useful book.
Got it. The question I was going to ask before I started that line of questioning was, what do you think it is about Homo Deus? And of course, Homo Deus is building pretty directly on ideas that he lays out in Sapiens. And I've read those two books. I haven't read Nexus. What do you think has made those books so popular? Because those are, like, particularly Sapiens, historically popular books.
Yeah, they are very popular books. I think it's the sense that you can discern these large-scale patterns, you can withdraw from the fray, so to speak, and you can understand what's really happening. So conspiracy theory goes at this in a particular, very different kind of way, that all you see is really smoke and mirrors, that the real engine of what's going on can only be touched by a conspiracy theory. This is the opposite approach. We'll withdraw from the fray, we'll look at these large-scale patterns, and we'll analyze what these patterns mean and how they actually work. That sort of ties in, doesn't it, with the omniscient viewpoint, the idea that somehow you can see what's really happening. So conspiracy theory goes at what's really happening in one way. This omniscient viewpoint goes at what's really happening in a completely different way. But of course, it totally depends on the accuracy of the underlying premises. And if those premises are not accurate, then what you see is going to be a real distortion of what in fact is happening.
Yeah, that makes total sense. All right. This has been such a rich, deep conversation. I have a few questions I like to close every episode with. So obviously you've touched on one of them already, so feel free to bring those answers back in, or if there's more things that come to mind. What is one thing you wish people paid more attention to?
Well, the one thing that I hope everyone would pay more attention to is the relationships we have with our natural environments. That it's just so shocking to me that as a culture, we can decide to ignore global warming, for example. We can decide to ignore extinction of species. We can decide to ignore the results of the homogeneity of grains, for example. So this goes back to the Trump administration and its vendetta against the DEI initiatives. But diversity is crucial for resilience and recovery. And I mean that in a genetic sense, not just in a social sense as well. And that we can ignore the importance of preserving our diverse genetic heritages in plants, for example. It's so shocking that we can just go merrily on with our individual lives, ignoring these large-scale problems and voting in ways that allow that ignorance to percolate at every administrative, political level. So, yeah, I would really hope that people would get more in touch with their natural environments, realize more their interdependence with natural environments, and experience their natural environments more with a respect for diversity, cognitive diversity, genetic diversity, etc.
Amazing. You referenced some answers to this question already, but I'll say it again. What is one resource you recommend for making better sense of reality?
Well, of course, I'm going to say this as a literary scholar, but literary fiction is a great way, a great resource for understanding things that are happening around us. And I already mentioned Richard Powers' book, The Overstory. But there's all kinds of wonderful fictions which enlarge our viewpoint. Symbiosis is the name of a book about an intelligent plant that comes into a strong cooperative relationship with an exoplanet civilization.
I love that book so much.
So there are lots of books like that, wonderful books that enlarge our perspective and give us deep, rich experiences of what the whole cosmos is about, not just Earth, but exoplanets as well.
Yeah, the semiosis. I haven't read Usurpation yet, but Suberg really did something incredible. So I totally agree.
So what is the book you mentioned with Light Eaters?
It's by Zoe Schlanger, who's a contributor to The Atlantic. And yeah, it's kind of a survey. She actually references semiosis in it pretty extensively. Really looking at the kind of edges of research into, the reality of the inner lives, let's say, of plants.
And it's called Light Eaters?
The Light Eaters, yeah.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah.
Great title.
Definitely recommend it.
Okay.
But so the final question, what is one moment when your sense of reality was disrupted?
Well, I could reference many moments in the political sphere where my reality, what? How could that possibly be happening?
Like 5 yesterday.
But I'll stick with the theme of Bacteria to AI and say, I never thought that in my lifetime I could have a conversation, intelligent conversation with an artificial intelligence. I never thought that would happen. And that was a real reality bender for me. And in fact, started me on the whole journey that ended up in this book, Bacteria to AI.
Amazing. So your encounter, was that GPT-3?
Yeah.
Wow. Well, I'm glad that happened so that we have that book. Speaking of that book, is there anything, obviously we covered a lot, but there's exponentially more in that book. Is there anything we didn't cover today that you'd want to put a little tag out to folks if as another invitation into the book?
Well, the one thing we didn't talk much about was this idea of reversible internalities. And I'd like to just say, because I'm not sure I explained it in the best possible way in the book, that my idea is that framing has come front and center as our sense of relationality has increased, and that it's really important to understand the frames by which we evaluate things. So I used in the book Jennifer Gabris's the Forest Atlas project, but mentioned that there's 2 different ways you could look at that. People are putting digital sensors and digital computational devices in forests to measure forest processes. That's putting the forest within the digital. But you can also put the digital within the forest and say that the forest is a complex analog computational device, and that we can make the translation into digital so we can better understand these processes. But you get very different ethical imperatives if you put the forest in the digital as compared to putting the digital in the forest. So the idea that the frame you choose is always multidimensional. There's always more than one frame to think about any problem. And therefore, your choice of frames has ethical and political dimensions. The choice of a frame is never neutral. And that's true politically, that's true economically, it's true socially, culturally, and even literarily. So I'll just close with that idea.
Amazing. That is a perfect place to close. Professor Hayles, thank you so much for spending time with me today.
Well, thank you, Jesse. This has been a wonderful conversation to have with you. Really appreciate all your keen insights on this.
This podcast is edited and produced by Adam Labrie and me, Jesse Damiani. The podcast is presented by Reality Studies. You can learn more by visiting realitystudies.co. And if you appreciate the work I'm doing, please subscribe and share it with someone you think would enjoy it.